Now let's move on to the next topic, which is related to labor supply. When looking at labor supply, we need to first think about who supplies labor and then how the decisions are made. It turned out that it is households supply labor. And when the households are deciding how many labor units they are providing, again, they are making a trade-off. So what kind of trade-off they are made? Well, let maybe the individual or the household think about how many benefits they are going to get when they supply labor. On the other hand, they can also think about how would be the cost that will occur when they supply labor. And then they can trade off the cost and benefit when they provide labor services. It turned out that the cost for working more is losing time for leisure. So why that is so? Well, when you supply the labor, it means that you cannot have time for fun. You forgot the happiness or the utility for having leisure. So then what should be the benefit of supplying labor? The benefit for working more is more income you can get for consumption. So when you work, you are going to gain some more income. And then with those income, you can spend it, and which means that you can consume. And then again, when you choose to consume, it will increase your utility. So when we are looking at labor supply from the individual's or household's perspective, we know that at the end, we are looking at the utility function. That utility function values consumption and leisure. While we supply labor, we can afford to consume more. However, we forgot the opportunity to enjoy the happiness we can get when we have leisure. So now we already know the cost and benefit an individual is thinking about when they are providing labor services. So the next step we want to do is that we want to think about how to come up with the labor supply curve. When we are looking at the labor supply, we want to look at the relationship between price and the quantity. As we mentioned earlier, the price for the labor market is the wages, and in particular, it is the real wages. And when we are thinking about the quantities for the labor supply, it is how much labor that an individual is willing to provide. So now we want to think about when there is changes in wages, how will that affect individuals' willingness in providing labor services? So now let's think about when wage increase, how will that affect the decision about how many hours that you want to work? When you are making that decision, you are trading off the cost and benefit. The cost is the time that you spend on working, and then you forgot the opportunity to have leisure. And the benefit that you are going to get is the income you gain from working, and then you can use those income for consumption. So there are two effects going on when the real wages increases. The first effect is called the income effect, which indicates that when the real wages increase, the labor supply should fall. On the other hand, there is another effect called the substitution effect. It indicates that when the real wages increase, the labor supply increases. So now let's first talk about the income effect. To think about this effect, you can imagine that if you win a big lottery, when you win a big lottery, how will that affect your decision about how many hours you want to work? Well, if you win a big lottery, it means that you get a big, huge amount of income at one time. And then once you have such a big income, you may think, well, I already have enough to eat. I want to have more leisure to increase my happiness. Then you will choose to work less. Therefore, the income effect indicates that when the real wages increase, the labor supply falls. Then how about the substitution effect? I want you to think about the example that when you get a one-day wage increase, then how many hours that you want to work for that day. So for example, if you work part-time as a tutor to teach small kids, And then the hourly wage you are going to get is about $200 or at most $600, depends on what kind of activity you are tutoring the kid. Then the substitution effect tells us that if there is a one-day wage increase, for example, I provide you an RA job and I say, hey, I will pay you $10,000 each hour you work on that day. Then how many of you are willing to take that job opportunity, and how many hours are you willing to work? I believe that even myself, for most of us, we will choose to work really hard on that day, because for that day, every hour we work are going to get $10,000, but for all the other days, we will only get a couple $100. Therefore, we believe that when an individual faces a wage increase, the substitution effect indicates that the labor supply should increase, because we would prefer to work more on the day the wage increase, but for all the other days, we prefer to work less. So it substitutes our work willingness on the other days to the day that we have the wage increase. And the reason why we want to work more on that day is because our hourly wage on that day, or our value for working on that day, is more than all the other days. Therefore, in general, we want to work more. So how will these two effects interact such that it affects the labor supply decisions? When the wage increases, there's always income effect and the substitution effect going on behind the scene. When the income effects dominate the scenario, the total labor supply should fall. If the substitution effect dominates the scenario, then the total labor supply should increase. So then when the wage increase, how will that affect the labor supply? In general, we believe that when the wage increase lasts for a long time, or when the wages increase are extremely high, the income effect will dominate the substitution effect. Therefore, the labor supply decreases. On the other hand, if the wage increase only lasts for a short time, as the example I gave you, then in general, we believe that the substitution effect dominates the income effect, such that the labor supply increases. Therefore, if you may recall from your micro class, when we draw the labor supply curve for an individual, the labor supply curve is a backward banded curve. That is, when the wages are low, then when the wages increases, an individual will tend to increase the number of hours they work. On the other hand, if their wage level has already been high, then the individual will tend to work less. That is, when the wage rate is low, it tends to be the case that the substitution effect will dominate the income effect. But once the income level or the wage rate is exceeding a certain level, then the income effect will dominate the substitution effect. So then when we want to come up with the labor supply curve for an economy, then how should be the aggregated labor supply curve look like? So in general, when looking at the aggregated labor supply curve, we assume that the substitution effect is greater than the income effect. That is, when the wages increase, the labor supply increases. Therefore, when looking at the labor supply curve in graph, we are only looking at this portion of the curve. That is, we assume that when the wage increases, the aggregated labor supply increases. We make this choice for two reasons. The first reason is that when the income effect dominates the substitution effect, it is when the wages are very high. But the scenario that the wages are extremely high is rare. Only the top, probably only 1% of people are enjoying high wages. Therefore, we believe that for the general public, when we are facing the labor supply decisions and we are in the wage range, that the substitution effect dominates the income effect. The second reason we make this choice is because when we are talking about wage increase, we are talking about wage increases now. Given that the period is about now, it won't last for a long time. On the other hand, if we are talking about future wages, then given that the future can be super long, then such an increase will be the wage increase that lasts for a long time. For example, if we know that our wages are going to increase in the future, it means that we believe in the future, the more hours we work, we are going to gain more from it. Therefore, in general, we will choose to work less today, take a good rest, and then begin to work hard from tomorrow onward or in the future. Therefore, given that when we are talking about labor supply, which is about the current wage relationship versus the quantity of labor, we believe that the wage increase is only lasts for a short time because it is only for current time, not for future. So when we are talking about wage increase, we are not talking about future wages unless we specify it explicitly. Therefore, we claim that when we are looking at the labor supply for an individual, when the wage increase, it can either increase the labor supply or decrease the labor supply. However, when we are looking at the aggregated labor supply curve, in general that we believe that it is a curve slope upward, which means that when the wage increase, people from the aggregated perspective will increase the total quantity of labor supplied. So what we know is that for an individual's labor supply, it is the function of the real wages. When the wage increase during the range of the wage that the substitution effect dominates the income effect, then the quantity of labor supply for an individual should increase. However, when the wage exceeds the level that the income effect dominates the substitution effect, then when the wage increase, the quantity of labor supplied by an individual should fall. In addition to that, the changes in wealth and changes in the future wages will also affect the willingness for an individual to work. So then when the wage changes, the choice of the labor supply will move along the labor supply curve. But then when the wealth gap increases and the future wage gap increases, then the quantity of labor supply will decrease. But first of all, we want to look at the impact of the wealth increase. How will that affect the individual decision about the quantity they want to supply for working? For example, if before today you are an ordinary individual of a Taiwanese, so then you work, for example, 10 hours a day or 12 hours a day because you want to gain enough for your own consumption. But then the next day when you wake up, you find out you are the prince or the princess of the kingdom. That's for that kingdom, they have the oil field or a gold field, which is really rich. Then it means that you are going to have a dramatic increase in your wealth. Then think about that. Will you work less or work more once you get this information? It turned out that for most of us, we are going to choose to work less because now we know even we don't work, we have enough resources for consumption. Therefore, we may choose to decrease the quantity of labor supplied. So then how about when there is a future wage increase, how will that affect your decision about the number of hours that you are going to work? It turned out that when the future wage increase, it means that the current wage is low relative to the future wages. So due to the substitution effect that you know you are going to get more in the future, then you are going to work less today, such that you are going to have more energy to work more hours in the future. Because of that, it will decreases the quantity of labor supply given the same wages. So then for these two factors, it will cause the shift of the labor supply curve to the left. So why it is so? That is because when we have a labor supply curve, then we are plotting the relationship between the real wages and quantity of labor supplied. Therefore, when the wages got higher, then we are going to supply more labor. But then when there is the changes in wealth or there is a future wage increase, it is about given the same level of the current wage, but then you choose to decrease the quantity of labor supplied at any level of the wages. Therefore, it will causes the left shift of the labor supply curve. So that is about the factor that will affecting the labor supply for an individual. How about the labor supply for the entire economy? We know that when we are talking about the labor supply for the entire economy, we need to add up the decision of all the individuals. And given that we know for an individual, the labor supply is the function of the real wages, it will be also affected by wealth and also the future wages. Then of course, these factors will also affecting the aggregated labor supply. So again, when the real wages got increased, then the quantity of labor supply from the aggregated perspective will move along the aggregated labor supply curve. However, when there is changes in the wealth or the future wages, then the change of the quantity of labor supply indicate that it will associate with the shifting of the labor supply curve. So in addition to that, because we are talking about the aggregated labor supply, in fact, when the working age population gets more, then it means that we need to add up more individuals. So then holding all the other things being equal, if the working age population increase, then the aggregated labor supply should increase. Same thing for the labor participation rate. If the labor participation rate becomes higher, it means that there are more people working. Given that the labor supply for all individuals are exactly the same, then when there are more people working, we add up more individuals. So when there are 5 people working, we have 5 units of the labor services. But when there are 100 people working, we have 100 units of labor services. Then for sure, when the labor participation rate is higher or there are more people be able to work, that is an increase in the working age population, both of them will increase the aggregated labor supply. Now let's look at the factors that will shift the labor supply curve. We said that when the people got wealthier, they will prefer to have more leisure, therefore the aggregated labor supply should fall. Moreover, when the expected future wages got increased, we also said that people prefer to take a rest today. Therefore, from the perspective of labor supply, then the labor supply should also decrease. It implies that given the same level of the wages, the quantity of labor supply should decrease. Then it will associate with a left shift of the labor supply curve. The next factor we are going to talk about that shifts the labor supply curve is when there is an increase in the working age population. So this happens, for example, a lot of countries after the Second World War, that there are baby boom after the war, therefore a few years later, that there are more people that attaining the age that can work. Therefore, for those cases, the economy will face an increase in the labor supply. And for those increase, it is given the same level of the wages, but then there are more people that can work, so there are more people working. Therefore, from the aggregated perspective, the quantity of labor supply should increase given the same level of wages. Therefore, it associates with right shift of the labor supply curve. The next factor that will affecting the labor supply curve is the labor participation rate. When there is an increase in the labor participation rate, for example, in Taiwan in the 1960s and 70s, traditional view about a woman's job got changed. Therefore, there are more women entering the labor market. When there are more women entering the labor market, the labor participation rate increases. When there is an increase in the labor participation rate, then it means that there are more labor supply. Because when we are adding up the labor supply by all the individuals, now we have more to add up. So then for that happen, then it will shift the labor supply curve to the right, because when it happened, given the same wages rate, the quantity of labor supply increase, so it will associate with right shift of the labor supply curve. So to wrap up what we have talking about so far, we know that the aggregated labor supply curve is a function of the wages, and the wage we are talking about here is the current wages. Then when the current wages got changed, the quantity of the aggregated labor supply got changed. For such kind of the change, it is associated with moving along the curve. But then for all the other factors that got changed, for example, the wealth got changed, the expected future wages got changes, the working age population got changed, or the labor participation rate got changed, all of them is about the given the same price level, and then some other factor got changed such that the quantity of the labor supply need to change. So then it means that given any level of the price, the quantity of labor supply should change. Then it will associate with shifting of the labor supply curve. And this concludes our discussion related to the labor supply.